On the 4th of August 1973, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote a letter to Lord Halsbury which contained a paragraph about Galadriel. This would prove to be some of Tolkien's last known writings about Middle-earth. Less than a month later, on the 2nd of September, Tolkien became ill and died, aged 81. So, what were Tolkien's final words on Middle-earth? In this video, we look at the concept of Galadriel Unstained. If you're familiar with Tolkien's work, you'll know that the history of Galadriel and Celeborn is somewhat confusing, owing to the fact that Tolkien never really completed it and made constant rewrites. For example, there's multiple explanations for origins of both characters, where they were during certain events and what they were doing. You might notice that throughout the timeline of Middle-earth, we have periods where both characters are incredibly important, only for them to suddenly vanish into irrelevancy for thousands of years. It's for this reason that both characters are the source of debate to this very day. So when you read the Silmarillion, you're only really getting half the story of both Galadriel and Celeborn as characters. Galadriel appears as very much like the female version of Feanor, although far less destructive. She's prideful and is an active member of the Noldoran rebellion against the Valar, and marches to Middle-earth with the host of Fingolfin. She would settle in Doriath, and there she meets Celeborn. The earliest version of his character was that he was a Sylvan prince from Lothlorien, but by this point in time, Tolkien had decided that he was a kinsman of King Thingol, a grandson of Elmo, his younger brother. Even as late as 1967, 6 years before Tolkien's death, these were the official versions of the characters: Galadriel, a chief actor in the rebellion of the Noldor, and Celeborn, a Sindarin prince of Doriath. But in 1968, Tolkien made a radical change. He decided to rewrite Galadriel and her role in Feanor's rebellion, and in the process, he decided to completely rewrite the character of Celeborn. This is what could be described as the gradual rehabilitation of Galadriel's character. In this version, Galadriel is described as being much greater, almost an equal to Feanor in mind and spirit. She still retains the same similarities to Feanor. She is prideful, wants to rule lands of her own, and eventually she loses faith in the Valar and joins Feanor's rebellion. But she's described as having a greater animosity towards Feanor, and when Feanor attacks the Teleri at the Haven of Alkalonde, she actually fights against Feanor's followers. Her goal in Middle-earth then becomes to thwart Feanor wherever she can. Now, believe it or not, Celeborn is here as well, although at this point, he's called Teleporno. Yes, this is where the legendary name of Teleporno comes from. Instead of being a prince of the Sindar, he's changed to a prince of the Teleri of Alkalonde. He's the grandson of Olwe. But funnily enough, in classic Celeborn fashion, he isn't actually described as doing anything, and is simply referred to as Galadriel's lover. We don't even know what he does in this version of events, but he seemingly ends up tagging along with Galadriel to Middle-earth on foot. To be honest, these aren't huge changes to Galadriel. She's still much the same, but has a greater animosity towards Feanor and ends up fighting against him. Yes, Tolkien seems to have envisioned Galadriel, Nerwen, the Man-Maiden, getting in the thick of combat. Shock. The bigger change was to Celeborn, although once again, he doesn't really do much. But Tolkien was not done here, and that brings us to Tolkien's final writings, written in August of 1973, only a few weeks before his death. And to be honest once again, these changes are massive. In notes that were transcribed by Christopher Tolkien in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien completely changes Galadriel's character and motivations. Instead of wanting to go to Middle-earth to rule and order things in her own way, Galadriel instead wants to leave because she now feels confined in Valinor. She feels like she's learned everything there is to learn, so in a way, she wants to go to Middle-earth to challenge herself. But she also doesn't want to leave without the permission of the Valar. Manwë knows that she wants to go, and while he hasn't granted her permission, he also hasn't denied her. To ponder her future, Galadriel goes to Alkalonde and there she meets Celeborn, Teleporno, once again a prince of Alkalonde. Together, they build a ship capable of sailing to Middle-earth, but just as they plan on asking the Valar for permission to leave, Morgoth destroys the two trees and the rebellion of the Noldor begins. Perhaps the biggest change is that in this version of events, Galadriel has absolutely nothing to do with the rebellion. In fact, she's completely against it, and she's completely against Feanor. When the kinslaying at Alkalonde begins, Galadriel once again fights against the Feanorians, but this time, Celeborn is also described as taking part in the battle. Good job, Celeborn. They manage to save his ship, and despairing about what has happened, the two of them set sail for Middle-earth. Although their motivations were completely different, and although they had no part in the rebellion, because they left at that time, they both fell under the ban of the Valar, and were forbidden from returning to Valinor. They land in Beleriand, and at some point in the First Age, they cross the Blue Mountains into the east. So in this version of events, Galadriel is completely blameless in regards to the rebellion, as Tolkien himself describes in Letter 353. Galadriel was unstained. She had committed no evil deeds. She was an enemy of Feanor. She did not reach Middle-earth with the other Noldor, but independently. Her reasons for desiring to go to Middle-earth were legitimate, and she would have been permitted to depart, but for the misfortune that before she set out, the revolt of Feanor broke out, and she became involved in the desperate measures of Manwë and the ban on all emigration. In this version, Galadriel is just unlucky. She was already planning to go to Middle-earth with good intentions, and as Tolkien says, Manwë would have granted her permission to leave, but unfortunately, she wasn't quick enough in asking. The rebellion broke out, Galadriel was at Alcalonde at the wrong time, and in Tolkien's own words, despairing now of Valinor, and horrified by the violence and cruelty of Feanor, set sail into the darkness without waiting for Manwë's leave, which would undoubtedly have been withheld in that hour, however legitimate her desire in itself. It's clear that Tolkien had pretty major rewrites in mind when it came to Galadriel and Celeborn, and the changing of Celeborn's origin and the changing of Galadriel's role in the rebellion was just the start. Unfortunately, as we know, Tolkien died just a few weeks later, and these rewrites remained as barely legible notes for Christopher to find. And given what Tolkien had already written about Galadriel and Celeborn, it was impossible to reconcile these notes with the rest of his work. It would have created even more inconsistencies, and ultimately, that's what Christopher was trying to do with the Silmarillion, make it as consistent as possible, even if it meant ignoring Tolkien's later writings or making minor changes himself. And on a side note, keeping Celeborn as a Prince of Alcalonde would have made Galadriel and Celeborn first cousins, and it's stated in canon that elves didn't marry that close. Celeborn's aunt would have been Eowyn, who was Galadriel's mother. Now, even with this Sindar and Celeborn, they're still related in the sense that they both share the same great-grandfather, the unnamed father of Elwë, Olwë, and Elmo, but that's a lot less weird. I don't want to finish this video with a fact about how Celebrian, their daughter, would have been inbred, so I'll just say, it's a shame that Tolkien died when he did. I mean, it would have been great if he could have lived forever, pumping out new lore and stories, but it seems his death was truly at an inopportune time. He still had so many more ideas, even as he was entering his 80s, and perhaps if he had lived 3, 4, or 5 years longer, the published Silmarillion would have looked a lot different. Perhaps not better, but it's something to think about. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I know I found it interesting. I knew Tolkien's last writings were about Galadriel and Celeborn, but I didn't realise the extent in which they were changed. I thought that happened in 1968, and the 1973 writings were just minor notes. Turns out I was wrong, and even in his final weeks, Tolkien's mind was still churning out greatness. Cheers, farewell, and teleporno. That is all.